Oh, hello there. Yes, well, it's another weary day, weary week, eek. Yes. Still, the clocks go back soon. It'll be, well, dark, won't it? Anyway, never mind. There's plenty to cheer about in the world, what with imminent threats of armed action at any moment against British citizens somewhere in far-flung corners of the world. Yes, the right-wing press were having a meltdown over the weekend about the Chagos Islands, simply because they could, and yes, there was an awful lot of things very, very sillily said. Nigel Farage, of course, got in the act, demanding that there's a Commons vote. You probably remembered that he's an MP. Wherever he is, he might have to fly back from wherever he is to actually take part, of course. And the Daily Telegraph had this, Keir Starmer faces common vote on Chagos Islands handover. Yeah, I mean, bearing in mind that we've agreed to do it, and the previous Conservative government had negotiated to do it, and the Keir Starmer has a huge majority in the Commons, and it's the right thing to do, and India, and the US, and the Mauritians, and most of the Chagos Islanders are quite happy about it, then I think it might just scrape home. But, of course, what this brings to light is the very ambiguous notion of British colonial ruling. Which the press really can't quite get their heads around, because it's very, 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 very good that the bits of the world that we still have a British flag on, like Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands, stay that way because they're ours, even though they're a very long way away. That's the thing, they are a very long way away. I mean, you can buy into the Channel Islands because, you know, that goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But realistically, when you get to other bits of the world, it's a bit iffy, isn't it? I mean, we used to own Malta, for example, and nobody particularly moaned about that. And if we're going to be historical about it, of course, I mean, this is an ongoing process ever since, you know, Churchill lost the grip of the British Empire, should it last 1,000 years, or whatever it was that he said about the length of time. Yeah, about 400. That was a good run for an empire. But they go. And they go for blindingly obvious reasons, basically because at the end it becomes a moral thing. Nobody's going to argue that the French shouldn't have let go of Algeria, or the Belgians with the Congo, or indeed us with anything that happened up until quite recently, like last weekend, realistically, eh? Yeah? Because if you think about Margaret Thatcher during the 80s, there were an awful lot of British colonial possessions that also went then. And it was just one of those things that was being done. Now, you can argue the rights and wrongs of Zimbabwe, which was probably the big one under her, but it was inevitable that it was going to go, in very much the same way as perhaps historically you could see it as inevitable that South Africa was going to, you know, eventually become more of an independent country than we pretended that it was throughout most of Thatcher's time. There's this graphic from The Guardian which kind of cheats a bit, but what it's suggesting here is, in fact, you know, it took Canada and Australia and New Zealand a long time to throw off those kind of shackles of Britain, and there are still dots in the ocean out there, and lots and lots and lots of people don't really want it anymore. I give you the Bahamas, yeah, and Bermuda. They don't really want to belong anymore or be owned, which is probably the way it is. But of course, this is where we end up with doing sort of moral somersaults, because it's very, very, very good that we had a colonialist, settlist sort of view of the world. And the bits that we did it to were really brilliant. But it was still a very moral case at the end that we had to let them go, because after all, India was kind of populated by an awful lot of people who might call themselves or regard themselves as Indians. So in the late 40s, it was probably a time for it to go. But, you know, when we think about modern colonialism and colonial settlers, we end up with very, very iffy concepts, like the Russians seeking to maintain what was the Russian Empire, and sort of using fairly sort of aggressive tactics, one might say, with places that may or may not be regarded historically as Russian, like the Ukraine, like Georgia, like Belarus. Or indeed, you know, one might argue about the Chinese getting sort of fairly aggressive with minorities in their country, be they Muslim or otherwise, yeah? And of course, nobody is allowed to mention whatsoever certain countries in the Middle East who appear very much hell-bent on a colonial settler viewpoint of the world. All three of those examples involve an awful lot of violence because those things are inherently violent, yes? The start of the British Empire was an inherently violent one because people turned up somewhere and subdued the locals that were there, or moved them, in the case of the Mauritians, or Chagos Islanders, I should say, I suppose. Because that's what you get. And the moral case is very, very iffy. But the British press, of course, living in a world of British being good, cannot accept that maybe it's about time we just walked away from that particular part of our past. Yes, it wasn't necessarily always glorious. We can argue the rights and wrongs about it all of the time. A bit pointless, really. Okay? Yeah. Ships loaded with slaves being shipped to places to make money for a certain elite of people and being backed up by the armed might of the British Armed Forces isn't in anyone's good books at all. And it shouldn't be. But making sure that we do the right thing in order to make the past better or proper is the right thing to do. So I imagine Nigel Farage will stand up and bluster about the geopolitical situation, in the strategic might of something or other in and around China. But that's not the world we should be living in. I think the majority of people would agree with that. Yes? Possibly. Yeah. Unless, of course, you're a Express journalist or a Daily Telegraph leader writer. Anyway, do have a lovely Monday. Yes. Hopefully. Stay warm, stay dry. It's getting to that time, isn't it?